In research, variables are what we're interested in, what we're trying to understand and know more about. To be more specific, researchers are trying to understand whether there are patterns in how a variable changes, which we refer to as variability. Given that, understanding variables helps the other parts of the research process make more sense. So we'll start there. Basically, a variable is anything that, well, varies. As this definition notes, there are a lot of possibilities for types of variables we can study. It's hard to think of things that don't have the potential to vary. One of the ratings for this module mentions the speed of light, and the freezing point in degrees Celsius is another one, I guess. You might have noticed that I said it has the potential to vary. So just because it doesn't vary for a particular person or situation doesn't mean it's not a variable. Researchers are interested in the variability across a group of people and/or across situations. In a previous recording, I mentioned that the two primary perspectives in research are quantitative and qualitative. I think we can make a case that the most substantial difference between those two perspectives is how they define the variables in a study. If a researcher primarily works with the variables in numeric form, we say they're doing quantitative research. In quantitative research, a numerical value is used for each participant for each variable, or each participant is placed in a category that can be represented by a number. If a researcher thinks about the ideas related to their variables, which are usually captured as text or in images, they're doing qualitative research. Each participant or each case could be represented by a page of text in an interview transcript, a set of emails or letters, a group of photographs, or various other representations of thought or behavior. It's important to note that the difference between the two is as much in how they treat the data about the variables as it is about the nature of the variables themselves. For example, a quantitative study could use words as data or use text to define a variable, but they would be counted or otherwise translated into a number. A qualitative study would not make that translation to numerical form. I'll explain more about the different approaches to analysis in that recording. Whether they're quantitative or qualitative, we can talk about variables in a few ways when we're thinking about research. One distinction we make is between the conceptual definition of a variable and the operational definition. The conceptual definition helps understand what we're talking about, but not necessarily in a way we can research it. For example, psychological constructs can't be seen. They often represent tendencies to think, feel, or act in certain ways, and they frequently involve internal processes, so they're not visible. The conceptual definition describes behaviors and internal processes that make up the construct, along with how it relates to other variables. In other cases, the variable might be visible, like exercise, and the conceptual definition is the more general or abstract explanation. Those types of definitions don't work for research, though, because they can be interpreted differently. Given that, research uses what's called an operational definition, a definition of the variable in terms of precisely how it is to be measured. There are often multiple operational definitions that can be used for the same variable. The study described in the summary on this slide includes an example of a conceptual definition and two operational definitions of the same variable, stress mindset. It might help to pause the recording to read the summary before I explain those examples. The information in the first sentence and highlighted in yellow is the conceptual definition of stress mindset, which is a concept. The information about enhancing or debilitating health and performance describes the related internal processes. The information in the middle and toward the end of the summary are the two operational definitions of stress mindset, a score on an implicit association test and a score on the stress control mindset measure. The research methods in psychology reading about psychological measurement includes another example that might be helpful. You might have heard about the study where researchers had children punch an inflatable toy called a Bobo doll. The study was carried out by Albert Bandura in collaboration with other researchers. They were interested in physical aggression in children, so the construct they were interested in was physical aggression. They filmed each child for 20 minutes as they played in the room with the Bobo doll. The operational definition of aggression was the number of times each child hit, punched, or kicked the doll. That was just the operational definition for that study, though. You might think of other ways to operationally define aggression. The scientific literacy book includes a few examples of the way a variable can be operationally defined, including the discussion of pregnancy-related deaths on page 105 and the discussion of homelessness on page 135. And on a bit of a lighter note, the section about the number of people who have been abducted by aliens from outer space on page 139 also relates to operational definitions. In quantitative research, we also differentiate between manipulated variables and measured variables. As you'll learn later in this module, manipulated variables are only used in experimental studies. By definition, a manipulated variable is one where the researcher systematically and intentionally varies the level of the variable participants are exposed to. Typically, they start by putting participants into groups. Then they either expose the different groups to different levels of the manipulated variable or expose the same group to different levels at different times. The different levels are referred to as conditions. In contrast, a measured variable is, well, it's just measured. Each participant is assigned a score for each variable based on the operational definition of the variable. So why do we care about the definitions and the types of variables? From the perspective of a researcher, they are the essential elements of a study. They're what the researcher is interested in. The operational definition of the variable also influences the conclusions they can draw. As a consumer of research, we need to ask whether the researcher is defining the variables in the same way that we think they are. And as a skeptic, thinking about the idea of a variable and the ways it can be defined encourages us to ask whether we're thinking about the same thing that someone else is thinking about when they make a claim. It also helps us evaluate the assumptions, sources of data, and potential agenda of the person sharing the information. The examples of the operational definitions from the scientific literacy book that I mentioned in the last slide relate to that.